Elena Voss stood at the edge of the grand hall, holding a tray of untouched wine glasses, invisible to everyone around her. The Founders' Ball was the biggest night of the year for the Continental Pax, a celebration of unity among the strongest wolf kingdoms in the world. Every alpha king, every heir, every powerful family had gathered under the crystal chandeliers of Cross Manor, and in the center of it all stood Damian Cross, the Alpha King, laughing loudly, with his hand resting on the small of Sable's back. Sable was his second in command, beautiful, confident, and always by his side. Everyone assumed she was more than that. Everyone except, apparently, Damian himself, who never bothered to deny it. Elena had been his mate for 3 years. Not his chosen mate, his convenient one. Their bond had formed the night of his coronation, when the moon had marked them together in front of the entire pack. Back then, it seemed like fate. Now, it felt like a life sentence. She set the tray down gently on a side table and watched him from a distance. He didn't glance her way. He never did anymore. "You look tired," said an older woman standing beside her. It was Martha, one of the kitchen staff who had grown fond of Elena over the years. "You should sit down for a moment." "I'm fine," Elena said softly, though her voice carried no real conviction. Martha studied her for a moment, her eyes full of quiet sympathy. "You deserve better than this, dear." Elena said nothing. She had learned, over the years, that saying nothing was safer than saying anything at all. Across the room, Damian raised his glass for a toast. The crowd quieted, waiting for his words. He talked about strength, unity, and the future of the Pax. He talked about loyalty and leadership. He did not mention his mate once. When the toast ended, applause echoed through the hall. Damian turned, his eyes finally landing on Elena. For a moment, something flickered across his face, perhaps guilt, perhaps irritation at being reminded she existed. He walked toward her, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Elena," he said, his tone flat. "You're not mingling." "I'm working," she replied simply. "You're my mate." "You shouldn't be working at your own husband's ball." Elena almost laughed at the irony. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her in the past month. Yet now he wanted her to smile beside him for the sake of appearances. "I didn't realize I was needed tonight," she said. Something in her tone must have irritated him, because his jaw tightened. "Don't start this again. Everyone is watching." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before parading Sable around all evening," Elena said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. The words landed harder than she expected. Several nearby guests turned their heads, pretending not to listen while clearly listening. Damian's expression darkened. "You are embarrassing yourself," he said quietly, leaning closer so only she could hear. "You were convenient, Elena, not chosen. Don't forget your place." The words cut deeper than anything he had ever said before, not because they were cruel. She had grown used to cruelty, but because they were said so plainly, without hesitation, as though they were simply a fact of life. For a moment, Elena said nothing. The hall buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet collapse happening in its center. Then, slowly, she reached for the pendant hanging around her neck. It was the mate pendant, a symbol of their bond, given to her on the night everything began. She unclasped it. Damian's eyes widened as she placed it gently on the table beside them, right in front of the Alpha Council members seated nearby. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply turned and walked out of the hall, her silence louder than any words could have been. What Damian did not know, what almost no one in the room knew, was that Elena was not an ordinary Omega. She was the last living descendant of the Voss bloodline, an ancient family of seers whose ability to sense true mate bonds was legendary among the Pax. When a Voss seer severed a bond, it was never a small thing. It sent a ripple of energy through the entire territory, a signal recognized instinctively by every unmated alpha nearby. The moment Elena's pendant hit the table, a wave of quiet power surged through Cross Manor. Alphas from neighboring packs, attending the ball as guests, felt it instantly, a pull, a whisper in their blood, telling them that a seer's bond had just been broken, and seers, unlike ordinary wolves, never bonded by mistake. If Elena had walked away, it meant she was worth pursuing. By the time Elena reached her small cottage on the edge of the Packlands, the news had already begun to spread. The next morning, a knock came at her door before the sun had even fully risen. Elena opened it to find a messenger from the Northern Frost Pack, holding an elegant envelope sealed with a wax insignia. A formal letter from Alpha Kion Reyes, the messenger said, bowing slightly. Elena blinked in surprise. She barely knew Kion Reyes, though she had heard of him. A quiet, respected Alpha King, known for his fairness and calm leadership. She opened the letter carefully. The words were simple, but sincere. Kion wrote that he had long admired her from afar, though he had never dared to approach a mated woman out of respect for pack law. Now that she was free, he wished to formally begin a courtship, if she was willing. Before she could even finish reading, another knock came at the door, then another. By midday, Elena's small home was surrounded by messengers bearing gifts and letters from Alphas she barely recognized. Alpha Tobias Kane, Damien's oldest rival, sent a case of rare moonstones, along with a note claiming he had always sensed something special about her, though it did not escape Elena's notice that his interest conveniently began the moment she caused Damien public embarrassment. Alpha Ronan Wild, known throughout the packs as a lone king who had never courted anyone, sent a handwritten letter, short, blunt, but strangely earnest, admitting that he did not know how to write love letters, but he wished to meet her regardless. Alpha Micah Sol, the youngest and most ambitious alpha in the council, sent an offer wrapped in political language, clearly hoping to align his pack with the powerful Voss bloodline. And finally, a letter arrived from Alpha Xavier Thorne, a family friend Elena had known since childhood. His words were the gentlest of them all. He reminded her of quiet afternoons spent together as children, of promises made long before Damien Cross ever entered her life. He said he had always loved her, silently, patiently, waiting for a day he thought would never come. Elena sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by unopened letters and gifts, overwhelmed by a version of her life she had never imagined possible. For years, she had been invisible. Now, suddenly, she was seen, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she truly was. It was both exciting and unsettling. Over the following days, word of the situation spread like wildfire through Packlands. Whispers filled every gathering. The woman Alpha King Damien Cross had discarded was the same woman Four Kingdoms now desperately wanted. Damien's humiliation deepened with every new rumor. Damien, for his part, refused to believe what was happening. He assumed it was some temporary embarrassment that would pass, that Elena would eventually return, tail between her legs, begging for forgiveness. But as days turned into weeks, and rival alphas continued visiting her cottage personally, his pride began to crack. One afternoon, Damien arrived at her doorstep unannounced, his expression a mixture of anger and something almost like desperation. "You need to come back," he said without greeting. "This is getting out of hand." Elena stood in her doorway, arms crossed, calm as still water. "I don't need to do anything." "You're embarrassing me," he snapped. "Do you understand what people are saying?" "I understand perfectly," Elena replied. "They're saying I'm valuable, something you never once believed." Damien's jaw clenched. "You're my mate." "I was your mate," she corrected gently. "Not anymore." "There's an old law," he said quickly, his voice tight with urgency. "A reconciliation clause, first mates can request." "I know the law," Elena interrupted, "and I also know it requires my consent, which you don't have." For the first time in 3 years, Elena watched something crack in Damien's composed exterior. Not sadness, not regret. Something closer to fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of losing status. Fear of losing the one thing he never realized he actually needed, her. "You don't understand what you're worth," he said quietly, almost to himself. "No," Elena said. "You didn't understand what I was worth. There's a difference." She closed the door gently, leaving him standing alone on her porch, the same way he had left her alone for 3 long years. Weeks passed. Elena continued receiving visits from her suitors, each offering something different. Tobias offered wealth and political power. Micah offered strategic alliance and ambition. Ronan offered blunt honesty and steady loyalty. But it was Kion and Xavier who lingered in her thoughts the most. Kion visited often, always respectful, always patient. He never pushed her for answers, never demanded her time. He simply sat with her during quiet afternoons, listening as she spoke about her childhood, her family's history as seers, and the quiet loneliness she had carried for years. He shared stories of his own pack, his hopes for peace between territories, his belief that leadership should come from patience rather than dominance. Xavier, meanwhile, brought comfort of a different kind. Familiar, warm, safe. Being around him reminded her of simpler times, before the weight of expectation and heartbreak had settled onto her shoulders. One evening, as autumn winds swept through the packlands, Elena sat by her fireplace, staring at the small pile of letters scattered across her table. She realized, for the first time in years, that she had a choice. Not a duty, not an obligation, a real choice. She thought of Damien's cold dismissal, Tobias's convenient timing, Micah's political ambition, Ronan's blunt sincerity, Xavier's gentle familiarity, and Kian's quiet patience. In the end, her heart did not choose based on power, wealth, or even history. It chose based on the simplest truth she had ever known, who had shown her respect before anyone else believed she deserved it. She sent a single letter the following morning, addressed to Alpha Kian Reyes. 3 months later, the Northern Frost Pack held a quiet, elegant ceremony beneath a canopy of silver trees. Elena stood beside Kian, dressed simply, her seer's mark glowing faintly beneath the moonlight as their bond formed, not from convenience, not from politics, but from mutual respect and genuine understanding. The union between the Voss Seer bloodline and the Northern Frost Pack created the strongest alliance the wolf world had witnessed in over a century. Packs that once fought over territory now cooperated under a treaty inspired by Kian and Elena's partnership. Peace, for the first time in generations, felt possible. Meanwhile, Damien Cross remained exactly where he had left himself, alone, prideful, and surrounded by whispers of what could have been. Sable eventually left his side as well, unwilling to stay attached to a king whose reputation had crumbled. His once great hall grew quieter with each passing season, the echoes of laughter replaced by silence. The very silence he once dismissed so easily. Elena, meanwhile, thrived. She became known not just as a seer, but as a wise and respected alpha queen, her calm strength inspiring loyalty across the northern territories. She often thought back to that night at the Founders' Ball, to the moment she placed her pendant on the table and walked away without a word. It had been the quietest act of her life, and yet it had changed everything. Sometimes, she realized, the loudest statement a person can make is simply choosing themselves, even when no one else recognizes their worth, especially when no one else recognizes their worth. And in the end, that quiet decision had led her not to loneliness, as she once feared, but to a life filled with genuine respect, partnership, and peace, the very things she had longed for all along.